Okay, welcome. We didn't finish the last chapter, so there was a little piece left. So here's the last little piece that was left. We need to talk about a hypothesis and what makes a good hypothesis. Okay, so what's a good hypothesis? Okay, so a good hypothesis has to be logical. Okay, it's a logical conclusion of a logical argument. What that means is that there is some evidence, some reasoning, basically some basis for your hypothesis. Now, as I mentioned before in a previous lecture, you have to search the literature to find some information, some resources about your idea, the thing that you're actually looking to do a study on. And you read some things, and you encounter these things called theories, and you get to know your subject area a little bit. Well, based on what you know, based on what you learn, you should be able to basically think about maybe what should be done next, or come up with an idea for a study of your own. And a good hypothesis which you can test. So it should be logical. In other words, it should flow out of existing literature, flow out of what is already known. A good hypothesis doesn't just come out of thin air. You don't just decide that, for instance, you're gonna, test or you're gonna test the prediction of whether, let's say, the moon is made of cheese. Okay, that just kind of came out of nowhere, just popped into my head, so to speak. I know in the past people believe that, but that's not a good hypothesis. Okay, it's not based on any actual research, any existing literature. There's no support for that. So a good hypothesis should be logical, reasonable. In other words, it flows from existing literature. There's a basis for it. There's a reason why you would think that. A good hypothesis should also be testable. All the variables, events, and individuals can be defined and observed. So you should be able to define the variables. So the actual things that you're going to manipulate, whether you're manipulating, let's say, mood, or or maybe exercise or marijuana use or something like that. Those are all things that could vary. Okay, you should be able to manipulate them. Manipulate the events, the different things that you're going to do, that you're going to subject the people to, all the things that are going to happen, basically. So a good hypothesis should be testable. It should be something that you can do a study on. Okay, I'll give you an example of something that doesn't work. Okay, for instance, some people have tried this and it just doesn't work. Some people have said, okay, I am going to show that God exists. Okay, that is not a good testable hypothesis. Okay, first of all, what are the variables? What are the events? What do you expect to happen? Who are your participants going to be? It's just one of those things that's not really testable. That falls in the realm of religion, in the realm of something that's more of a faith, right? You take, if you believe in God, you take that as kind of as fact, without evidence. It's kind of just faith. That's why they call it faith. But hypotheses are not like that. Good hypotheses should be testable. You should be able to identify the variables, the different things that have to be done so that you can test it. A good hypothesis should also be refutable. It should be, you should be able to demonstrate that it is false. So in other words, you do a study and you should be able to, if it works out that way, maybe it turns out that your hypothesis was wrong. It didn't work out the way you expected it. Or maybe, you confirmed your hypothesis. But in other words, you should be able to either confirm or refute your hypothesis. Now this, and that's what, and I'm going to mention again this idea about like trying to, have a hypothesis like, God exists or something like that. Well, you can't really refute that. Okay, you can't really study that. You can't really say that that is false or true based on any scientific study. So you can't really refute that. So a good hypothesis is something that you should be able to refute. In other words, you could show that it's false. You can confirm it, but you should also be able to show that it's false. A good hypothesis is also positive. In other words, it makes a positive statement about the existence of something. So let me explain that. A good hypothesis says that there is something. A good hypothesis says something like alcohol will increase aggression, or marijuana will, impair memory. So it says that something will happen. That's what we mean by positive. It doesn't say that something will not happen. A good hypothesis will not be something like, participants will not be more aggressive after consuming alcohol. It should not be something like, to put it more simply, alcohol will not increase aggression. That is a negative statement. Your hypothesis should also be positive. If your prediction is basically that alcohol is not going to increase aggression, and then you do your study and you find that alcohol doesn't increase aggression, you haven't shown anything. All you've done is basically shown that something doesn't happen. And that could be for many reasons. Maybe you did your study wrong. A good hypothesis must be positive. You must basically predict something, and then when you do your study, perhaps you confirm that. Okay, you confirm the hypothesis. That is something worthwhile. You should never seek out to show that something doesn't work, that it isn't true, something doesn't happen. That's just not what a hypothesis is. As a matter of fact, there's a very good reason why we don't make hypotheses of that kind. We don't say that something's not going to happen, because saying that something is not going to happen, saying that alcohol will not increase aggression, that is what we call the null hypothesis. That is the alternative hypothesis that you're trying to disprove. So a good hypothesis should always be positive. It should say that something happens, okay, not that something is not going to happen. Saying that something is not going to happen is the null hypothesis. It's the one you're going to try to refute, the one you're going to try to basically to exclude, to put it one way. All right, let's keep going. I've said too much about that. Now, before this lecture, we were talking about research ideas, okay? Okay, so if you develop a hypothesis, how do you take that further and create a research study out of it? Okay, well, the research process, steps 3 and 4. Step 3 basically says that we need to specify the variables, how they will be defined and measured. Okay, that's one thing we need to do, and your hypothesis will, will basically will have something to say about that. Okay, a good hypothesis will be able to lead to a specific prediction, and when you make a specific prediction, the variables should be clear. Alcohol, aggression, for instance, those are our two variables. If our hypothesis is that alcohol will increase aggression, then we can see that alcohol is one of our variables and another one is aggression. So we can define those, we can measure them. So it will lead us to step 3. Step 4 is to identify the individuals who will participate in the study and determine how they will be selected. We'll get to a chapter down the road where we'll talk about that. How to basically get participants for your study, how to select them, who may qualify, who doesn't. But we'll talk about something called sampling and the various methods you can use for that. Different research studies can be developed from the same hypotheses, by the way. Okay, it's possible to create more than one study from one hypothesis. For instance, you might decide from a hypothesis, for instance, that you're going to do an experiment, that it's best to do an experiment to test this hypothesis. It's best, for instance, like if your hypothesis is that alcohol will increase aggression, that's probably best done with an experiment. But you might also try to do an observation. Okay, and with an observation, you're not really going to show cause and effect, but you can show that alcohol and aggression are related. It's not cause and effect, okay, but you can show that there's some relationship there. Or actually, you can even do more than one kind of experiment, okay? You can do an experiment where, let's say, you use hard liquor as your you use hard liquor basically as your alcohol, okay? So your variable alcohol, you're gonna vary it by using hard liquor. In another study, maybe you use wine or beer or something like that. So you can create, you know, different kinds of studies from the same hypothesis. Okay, that is where we will end. It's just a little piece that we didn't cover from our last lecture. So I will stop this now.